Implications of the Panama port deal for U.S. national security. Nick Vyas is founding director of the Randall R. Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Robert.
Thank you so much for being with me today.
Good to
Nick,
be here.
the BlackRock investment firm has agreed to purchase a majority interest in two ports at each end of the Panama Canal from a Hong Kong-based management company after President Trump raised concerns about Chinese control over canal operations. What do you see as the implications of this deal?
Well, I think, Robert, what this raises the question beyond this particular transaction on both ends of the Panama Canal is that U.S., specifically under the President Trump 2.0 agenda, there seems to be an extreme focus on both the physical and soft infrastructure and influence of that on the national security, as well as how the Chinese um, government could potentially use this as a weapon in the future and
Mhm.
a threat both on the Indo-Pacific side and as well as one of the critical artery of trade coming in and out of U.S.
Yeah. Well, recall the Dubai Ports World controversy back in 2006 when Congress voted to block DP World's purchase of management contracts at six major U.S. seaports. Was that the first time that we'd seen concerns about foreign influence over port operations, and have there been any since?
Well, I think the physical infrastructure, specifically the critical linkage and the critical nodes within the supply chain, has always been seen as the national security paradigm.
Mhm.
However, for like 2 or 3 decades, that wasn't the focus. Uh, in fact, uh, focus was more so to your point about the DP World coming in and managing port at home would have been
Yeah.
seen, but not something away from home that we looked at that in a microscope, the way a Trump 2.0 agenda has called out to review the entire global trade supply chain network and understand where the vulnerability could be exposed. And the Panama Canal was very close and target under this lenses that we just opened up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to hear President Trump speak, it's like he considers the Panama Canal to be home. So that
That,
that's a
that is
interesting.
correct. That is correct. But I mean, you think about, you can literally stop the trade flow if there were to be some concerns of this nature were to sprout up.
Mhm.
Uh, and so the Panama Canal is, in my view, which is just the beginning of how this could play out across the larger network.
Yeah. Well, up to now, though, has there been any evidence that China was exerting control over the canal, such as favoring the passage of Chinese ships over other flags?
Well, there hasn't been any sort of a solid physical evidence to speak of. But you look at this concern has been not just on the Panama Canal, but even the gantries and other hardware
Mhm.
installed across the US port made in China. The concerns were always there. Could there be uh, some sort of an IoT devices that's spying on the trades coming in and out and transactions on the flow and give away the threat in the future. So those concerns were there. And
Mhm.
I think this actually stemmed for a larger ecosystem related issues. It just Panama Canal was the easiest target because we built it, we operated, we hand over the control to the Panama country, and apparently those two large port at the entry, both on both sides of the canal, was actually operated by it. So this concern really stems from the larger issue at hand about the national security and can one country who has an influence of controlling that would disrupt the global trade and could be used or weaponized
Mhm.
for in a case of crisis.
So, in other words, it hasn't been seen yet, but it's seen as a potential.
That is indeed the
Right.
question. Yes.
Yes, and as we know, China has been very busy in the last couple of decades investing heavily in supply chain infrastructure around the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative and ownership of ports all over the place. Just what is the extent of Chinese company control over ports around the world that they currently own or manage? Is it extensive?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you think about it. We, in an entire century, one of the biggest projects that we undertook was the Panama Canal,
Yeah.
right? It was 100 year, in a century, I'm talking about.
Hmm.
And then you compare that in a microcosm of the physical infrastructure under the Belt and Road initiatives that China built. It's $1.5 trillion linking the waterways, the railways, roadways, and airways. That's just the physical infrastructure, and aspiration is also layering on top of the digital infrastructure. So certainly China has done an incredible job of creating the linkage. Go back, I mean, that's a thousands of years of old history. The Silk Route, China really, President Xi's aspiration is to actually have the modern day Silk Route, but connectivity in a greater sense across multimodal
Hmm.
capabilities, tying the Asia to the Africas to the Europe, and basically building this entire infrastructure. So you're right.
Yeah.
China has done an incredible job of expanding that influence. And I think President Trump, and especially in the Trump 2.0 agenda, that has been the core focus.
Hmm. Well, there are also reports of concerns and challenges in the Chinese economy that have caused China to step back somewhat in some parts of the world in those investments. I'm wondering, is that a basis for not a basis for complacency? Can we still expect Chinese companies to continue to expand their control over the supply chain ecosystem around the world?
Well, absolutely. I think, listen, that cat is out of the bag.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, China is the second largest economy. They have expanded the influence, build the core competency, including the consumption market at home. So China is is a force to reckon, and I think there could be a space in a global framework if properly approached and applied, and the rules were to be established for more than one player to be part of it. So I hope that at some point we look at this global trade and create some harmony in terms of understanding how the roles can be evolved, that the superpower being a one entity versus multi-entity versus creating some rule-based natural order that prevents us from going into the conflict-based scenarios and rather operate in a much more prosperous, peaceful, and harmonious ways. Listen, one of the big threat, Robert, that we're facing as a humanity is, yes, this tensions on the physical infrastructure. But at the end of the day, some of the real issues are the sustainability, some of the climate related issues, some of the
Yeah.
exploitation of resources, including human capital in certain extents. All of these things are real burning platform issues. How do
Mm.
we really come together and solve this threat that we have? And I'm hoping that, hopefully this conversation and dialogues and repositioning President Trump's sort of a focus of balancing some of the forces. Hopefully, all of those things comes to fruition in a very meaningful way.
But seeing what's happening here, should the U.S. be relying on private asset managers like BlackRock to do the heavy lifting here? Are financial firms becoming key players in national security strategy?
Well, Robert, listen, we are the gold standard when you talk about the public-private partnership,
Hmm.
right? I mean, government should and cannot be the sole player of designing and delivering and executing all of these things. In fact, they're the last to get into this game. So I think this public-private partnership, I'm a big proponent. I think we actually promote that. And as long as there's a transparency, as long as there is a clear distinctions that the private partnerships are somewhat open to other private companies and access is granted to all the fair players, I think
Hmm.
this is a brilliant ways to do this. At the end of the day, private companies have a much better ways of running day-to-day operations than the government would.
But you don't want to see a private company asserting monopoly control any more than you want to see a nation asserting proper monopoly control. It'd be the
In,
same
in,
concern. Interesting.
indeed,
So,
indeed.
yeah. So, do you see this BlackRock deal leading now, signaling a broader trend of strategic asset protection, or is it just a one-off reaction to political pressure?
No, I think that this is a golden opportunities for private entity to come and build infrastructure. Listen, if we were to think about onshoring our advanced manufacturing and semi-advanced manufacturing onto the US. There's no way we can build the physical and soft infrastructure by government. That is absolutely, I mean, 40 cents on every dollar is wasted when government executes the government contracts. So we need the private companies. It will be a broad private organizations working together with government, delivering, building, and running it efficiently. And hope if that gets executed well, there will be a huge, enormous momentum of
Hmm.
companies to come home to.
But with the national security implications at hand here, you do want government to be there in the picture. You
Well,
don't.
government will be
Hmm.
initiator. Government will be sort of laying out the rules of these things. But I think this approach of having the private company come in and run the operations, specifically on the critical national security nodes of our global trade, I think
Yeah.
that's a phenomenal example of how public-private partnerships can actually excel.
Nick Vyas at the USC Marshall School of Business. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this critical issue. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Robert. It was great to talk to you.